Welcome to episode 231 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Lance Leising, who served in the FBI for nearly 23 years. In this episode, he reviews his FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitive investigation of Jason Derek Brown. Jason Brown is wanted for the execution-style murder and armed robbery of Keith Palomares, a 24-year-old armored car guard carrying the weekend deposits of a movie theater in Phoenix, Arizona. In November 2004, Jason Brown shot Palomares and fled with the money. He is still at large. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $200,000 for information leading directly to the arrest of Jason Brown. Jamie Brown Martin, Jason Brown's sister, is also a guest on this episode. Jamie, who lives every day with the horrible truth and many consequences of his brutal act, provides her personal insights about her brother, his actions immediately following the murder, and why she is cooperating with the FBI in the efforts to locate and apprehend her brother. A little bit about Lance Leising. You can read his complete bio in this episode's show notes. Lance spent his entire FBI career in the Phoenix Division and 19 of his 23 years on the Violent Crime Major Offender Squad, where he specialized in fugitive, robbery, kidnapping, interstate threats, and homicide investigations. He served on the Phoenix FBI SWAT team for 22 years, including 7 years as a team leader. For the last 5 years of his FBI career, Lance was the supervisory special agent over the Phoenix FBI Desert Hawk Violent Crimes Task Force and the SWAT supervisor. Since retiring from the FBI, Lance is employed by Amazon Global Security in their Critical Incident Operations section as an industry specialist in crisis management. I want to thank the Phoenix Division and the current case agents for allowing Lance to speak with me about this active fugitive investigation. I truly hope this case review will result in additional leads about the whereabouts of Jason Derek Brown. I also want to thank Jamie for coming on the show with Lance and for her honest conversation about what it's like to cooperate with the FBI when a family member has committed a horrific crime like murder. Lance starts off the case review and Jamie joins in on the conversation about 25 minutes in. Before we get to the interview, I want to update everyone on CrimeCon 2021. FBI Retired Case File Review will be on the world-famous podcast row, but not in person. Whether you're traveling to Austin or attending virtually, please drop by my virtual booth to say hello. CrimeCon is from June 4th through the 6th. If you haven't bought your ticket yet, use code FBI 2021 for a 10% discount. CrimeCon is a weekend-long event dedicated to all things true crime, featuring speakers and panels and breakouts and hands-on experiences and true crime podcasts. And I hope you'll drop by my virtual booth to ask a question or to just say hello. Also, related back to this episode, I wanted to let you know that in my May Reader Team email, I reviewed the bank and armored car robbery movie, The Town. Have you noticed that there are no ads on FBI Retired Case File Review? That's because I hope you'll support the show by joining my reader team and purchasing my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books, available wherever books are sold. There's a link to join my reader team in your podcast app's description of this episode. Once a month, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. And when you join my reader team, I'll send you my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 60 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. And you'll also get my FBI reality checklist of 20 misconceptions about the FBI. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Lance Leising and Jamie Brown Martin. Thank you both for coming on today and sharing your thoughts and insights about this fascinating fugitive investigation.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And for those of you who skipped the introduction, Jamie Brown Martin is the author of Center of Attention, her memoir about the absence and disappearance of loved ones and how it affected her life. And one of those family members is her brother, Jason Derek Brown, the subject of this case review. Lance, could you start us off? Who is Jason Derek Brown and what is he accused of doing?
Sure. Let me set the stage a little bit. It was November of 2004. During that time, I was assigned to the Phoenix field office of the FBI, and I was assigned to a violent crime squad. On that squad, we had a lot of different responsibilities, but any federal violent crime we handled, and that include robberies, to include bank robbery, and then what we in the federal system call Hobbs Act robberies. And that's where armored cars fall into. So this was an armored car robbery, along with an execution, I would call it, more than just a homicide. And I'll get to those details in a minute. But my squad had responsibility for all bank robberies and armored car robberies in central Arizona. Armored car robberies are under the Hobbs Act. The Hobbs Act is essentially a federal statute that gives the FBI jurisdiction over any robbery that affects interstate commerce. Armored car carriers carry federally insured funds across interstate lines, so they're clearly within the Hobbs Act guidelines, and that's kind of why we respond to robberies. How we were set up at the time is our squad did not have a true task force set up, but we worked every day with local departments around Phoenix, including Phoenix Police Department. And when a bank robbery or armored car robbery came out, that department would give me a call or somebody on my squad a call, let us know that they're responding because we didn't get the 911 calls. And that's what happened on November 29th in 2004. So there was a report of an armored car robbery with a guard being shot in Ahwatukee. Ahwatukee's upscale suburb of Phoenix, south side of Phoenix. They don't get many violent crimes such as this. It's a nice area. So I was called by the sergeant over their violent crime squad in Phoenix saying, hey, they got a report of a robbery. About the same time, I was also called by Dunbar Armored Car Security, letting the FBI know that there was a robbery and possibly a guard shot. So this doesn't happen very often. Armored car robberies are pretty rare. Phoenix has plenty of bank robberies, upwards of 250 or more in a year, at least during the heyday, the peak time in the 2000s. But armored car robberies are a little different. Most of them are very violent. Most of them involve shots being fired because they're going after money that's guarded by armed guards. It's a little more high risk than a regular bank robbery. So we don't get many of them. This one, especially in Ahwatukee, seemed incredibly important because a guard had been shot. So at the 911 call, I responded down to the scene along with Phoenix Police Department, and we had a lot of us going down there. And when we got down there, this is what we found out from the witnesses that were there. It was a nice, Phoenix day in November, so it's probably in the 70s. It was at the AMC movie theaters, and it was after a long Thanksgiving holiday weekend. So they had a big box office weekend, a lot of people coming to and from, and this was the Monday cash pickup after that holiday weekend. The armored car guard, a Dunbar truck, pulls up in front of the theater. There's a breezeway walking up to the ticket booths. Per policy for almost every armored car company, the driver stays with the truck and the courier gets out of the armored car and walks in with the bag and collects the money and comes back out. Both are armed, both wearing bulletproof vests. So that's what happened according to the witnesses in the surveillance video. Keith Palomares was the courier that day. So he's the Dunbar armored car guard, the courier, and he walks from the armored car to the ticket windows. And it's probably a 30, 40 yard walk down this breezeway. He goes in and picks up the weekly holiday proceeds, which was only $56,000. In the big scheme of things, it wasn't that much money. So he had $56,000 as he was exiting. An individual at the time described as either white or Hispanic, wearing a hoodie over his head, came walking out of a adjoining breezeway, approached Keith as he was walking out of the movie theater and began firing. No demand for money. None of the witnesses heard anything like that. It was just 6 shots in rapid succession, all aimed at Keith's head. 5 of the 6 shots impacted Keith above the neck. So Keith went to the ground there. He never got his gun even out of the holster. He might have broken the leather a little bit. The gun was found under him, but he never had it in his hand. It was just barely out of the holster. All witnesses said, though, that he maintained a very solid grip on the cash bag, and the individual that killed him had a hard time pulling it from his hand. Ultimately did pull it from his hand, stumbled as he was running away, dropped both the gun and the bag of money, picked them up, jumped on a mountain bike that happened to be in that adjoining breezeway, and pedaled as fast as he could down the way. One of the witnesses, who was a painter that happened to be painting park benches right there in the breezeway, yelled at him to stop. And the individual stopped, turned around and looked at him. And then I think the witness decided this was probably a bad idea, and then turned and ran back. And the individual, the subject, kept going. So that was the initial reports that we received from the witnesses. There was a heavy police response. So we had my whole squad, or everybody that was available, probably 8 FBI agents, along with an entire robbery squad from Phoenix Police Department, as well as a homicide squad. And then the SWAT team, air units, probably 30 patrol officers, crime scene techs. So that was the response. A lot of FBI cases, the FBI is involved a little bit later. We usually get called because we don't handle the 911 reaction most of the time. But in this case, we responded right along with Phoenix PD, and it was our joint case along with them right from the get-go. So I spent many years on a violent crime squad. And when you respond to crimes like this, as a young agent, you kind of get some preconceived notions about who the subject might be, at least like what their criminal history might be, what their background is. As you progress through your agent years, you try to avoid those preconceived notions because they can pigeonhole you, become a better investigator when you open your mind. I was younger. I probably only had 5 years in, 6 years maybe at the time. And I remember going down there thinking, oh, this is going to be somebody with a long criminal history. This is going to be somebody who's had several robberies in the past. You don't just graduate to executing an armored car guard and robbing an armored car. This is going to be somebody who has been around before. We've seen him before. This isn't going to be new. That turns out to be, as you'll see, far from the truth. This was an execution, not just a robbery. And it was committed by somebody that you would never expect.
In most cases, your assumption would have been correct, that it is a graduation of violence. Somebody who starts off with a bank robbery and then escalates to an armored car. So I think a lot of people would have made some of those assumptions.
Right. As a violent crime agent, it's easy to make those assumptions. And in fact, at times it's smart, because our subject pool, you'll go to previously convicted bank robbers or people who have done this before and look for physical matches or other matches that might develop suspects for you.
The usual suspects.
Yeah. Right, exactly. You go to the usual suspects, and that helps. But in this case, it threw us off track. In fact, we did that initially. I was looking at recently released bank robbers, other armored car robbers in the area, trying to see if they matched or where they were at the time in the first maybe 48 hours. But we were able to focus our investigation pretty quickly with the evidence we found at the scene. We had witnesses. Now, none of the witnesses saw the subject well, so the only physical description we had at the time was, like I said, white or Hispanic male, medium height, wearing a hoodie pulled up over his head and left on a mountain bike. That's all we had. There were a few witnesses in the general area. That the movie theater was closed, but there were landscapers and painters and some employees from a restaurant. And then, of course, we canvassed and spoke with every employee from every business in that mall area, that outdoor mall. And we were able to gather some interesting information at the scene, such as, a couple employees at one of the shops remember seeing a silver sedan, is how they described it, a sporty sedan in the parking lot in the 2 weeks prior to the robbery. Every morning around that time, one person sitting inside, always changing spots within this large parking lot, but had no other description other than that. We also had the surveillance video that was, as you'd expect, grainy and horrible. Really didn't show much other than the subject running up. You can't even see the actual shooting, but then you see the aftermath, and then you see him tripping and running away. We had the casings and projectiles at the scene, which the casings we determined were .45 caliber Corbon ammunition casings, and Corbon at the time was one of the highest powered ammunitions you could buy for a 45 caliber handgun, and fairly unique, fairly expensive. And that's pretty much what we had there at that immediate scene. The media was all over there. They were trying to get this out because, like I said, this was in a neighborhood that just doesn't get crimes like this. And the fact that he left on a bike. So we are getting tips left and right on bicyclists around Ahwatukee. Patrols trying to track those down. My squad's trying to track those down. We're trying to develop a suspect. The air unit that was overhead, also looking for bicyclists. I'm sure probably every bicyclist in a 5-mile area was stopped that day. But the air unit overhead was able to see what they thought was a bike stashed in a landscaped area, probably about a half mile away from the crime scene. So a couple Phoenix patrol officers went that way and determined there was a mountain bike that matched the description of the bike the subject fled on only a half mile away that was stashed under some bushes in a wash adjacent to a parking lot. So we're able to focus on that. And because of the nature of the crime, that we had an outstanding subject of a homicide, we decided to print and swab that bike right there at the scene. Normally, we'd send it to a lab and it would take a little while. We decided to do that with crime scene techs immediately right there at the scene. That response isn't immediate. It takes a while, especially at that time. We had a lab that was really backed up here in Phoenix, and they went for processing. But we were hopeful that we were going to get some evidence from that bike. There was no surveillance video covering that area. So really, that's all we had. We had the bike. We had 100 tips on different bikers. So Phoenix PD and the FBI just tried to prioritize those tips. I was the case agent from the start. A Phoenix detective named Tom Kalesa, who was a very seasoned homicide detective, took case for Phoenix PD. So we were working hand in hand, trying to prioritize all these tips that came in, trying to look, like I said, over the usual suspects, trying to develop a suspect. So that's where we were.
You were actually investigating the armored car robbery, and the detective was investigating more so the homicide.
Yeah, it's an interesting jurisdictional distinction there. So as most violent crimes in the federal system are, there's joint jurisdiction. Local authorities and tribal authorities here in Arizona often have joint jurisdiction over these incidents. Really, it depends on how well you work together, because you both have resources, and the FBI's resources are more national, more broad. Phoenix has a lot more patrol resources in the area. So we're both good at different things. So it's great when you band together, when you join those resources and use all the benefits Phoenix Police Department brings, a large local police department, and all the benefits the FBI brings. It usually results in the best resolution of a case. And that's what we did here. We still do have a great relationship with Phoenix PD, and we worked very closely with them. So they were looking at the homicide and the robbery. They were both local crimes. I am looking at the Hobbs Act robbery, and then the homicide that results from it is also an additional charge and ultimately sentenced within the federal system. So either way, whoever did this crime was facing a very long time in jail. It was easier for Phoenix Police Department to prove just the homicide than it would have been for us to prove a Hobbs Act and all the other elements beyond that. So what we decided was Phoenix PD locally would take the homicide and charge that, and then we would work to develop any other charges if we needed to. And if the subject had fled out of state, we would take lead.
And so the bike really proved to be, as they say, the smoking gun in this matter.
It did. So the bike brought us over the edge. We took those DNA swabs and fingerprints from the bike, and it took about 2 days. But after a couple of days, we got a match on the fingerprints on the bike, and they came back to an individual named Jason Derek Brown. Now, almost about the same time we got a match on that, other information was starting to come in that also implicated Jason in the crime. So I told you we had hundreds of tips all around that Ahwatukee area about suspicious individuals on bikes. And we had a tip from a nearby hotel of an individual that was at that hotel that was shoving a mountain bike in the back of a silver sports car, 2-door sports car. Once we got Jason Brown's prints and we got a name, the dam breaks and it opens up, right? We're flooded with information because now we have somebody to look into. So we have all his registered vehicles. We're looking for places he stayed. We're looking for cell phones, anything we could to gather more information about who Jason Derek Brown is. Was he in this area? Is he really a subject, or did he just happen to have his hands on this bike at a store when it was sold? Well, we found that he had multiple vehicles registered to him, motorcycles, a Cadillac Escalade, very nice silver BMW convertible. So we're prioritizing all these tips, like I said. And now we have his prints. And now we have a hotel that says, hey, there was a Jason Derek Brown staying here, driving a silver BMW, checked out the night of the homicide. That hotel was only about 2 miles from the scene of the crime. And he was seen shoving a mountain bike in the back of this 2-door small silver sedan.
Before you go on, Lance, I just want
Yes.
to check in with Jamie.
I'm right here.
You're okay?
I'm great.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to check because
Okay.
I'm sure, having to relive and hear about this can be disturbing.
Yes. Thank you, Jerry.
That's smart. I know this is going to be a hard day for you, Jamie, and please let us know if we need to take a break.
Okay.
So like I said, once that print came back on that bike, then the floodgates opened. So it's interesting where that print came from because ultimately found that Jason Derek Brown had very little criminal history. But the print did come back, and it came back from an incident that him and his brother David were arrested in North Carolina a few years prior. And the incident was at a golf shop, or actually a couple of golf shops, where David kind of distracted the employees while Jason grabbed some high-end golf clubs and ran out of the store. So they did that at one shop. Local sheriff was called, was taking the report at that shop and called neighboring shops. And a neighboring shop said, hey, they're here at this shop right now. The very adept sheriff's deputy was able to track them down. And when he pulled them over, they both provided California driver's licenses that were not in their names. They were false identifications. They had their picture on them. This will be important later. They had their picture on them, but a completely fraudulent name, date of birth, and other identifying information. He ran fingerprints, and there was a old misdemeanor fingerprints in the system on both Jason and David, and determined their true identities there. So we got a history of Jason using false IDs there in a very small level criminal activity in North Carolina. So that's where that hit came. So we got that. We got all his information. We're starting to gather cell phone information. We're starting to gather vehicle information, residential history, all that type of stuff. But then we also run him through ATF's database on gun purchases. And we found that just 2 weeks before the homicide, Jason was in Salt Lake City and went to a gun dealership and purchased a Glock 45 caliber handgun. Sent agents out there immediately to go interview the gun owner. And he described how Jason came to the shop, was very interested in the highest power, biggest handgun he could find, and then also purchased several boxes of Corbin ammunition, which was the type of ammunition we found at the scene of the homicide. The gun shop owner said Jason was adamant about buying the strongest rounds, the biggest gun. He took a class as well in gun safety and how to shoot. And then he also was photographed pursuant to state law there on when he was purchased a gun. And the photograph that you see in the red hooded sweatshirt, Jason, on the FBI wanted poster, that's the photograph he took when he purchased the Glock. I think it's kind of an interesting photo if you look at it. Jason kind of has a little smirk on his face. Often in photos, he had a smirk on his face, to be honest. But at that moment, he's purchasing a gun that he knows he's going to use to kill somebody. Just that snapshot in time is an interesting photo, and it ends up being one of the photos on his FBI top 10 wanted poster.
One of the things I find extremely interesting, you talked about him doing this armored car robbery and that he had never done a regular bank robbery before. But now he is designing a robbery using a gun, and it sounds like he had never used a gun before. I mean, he's taking lessons.
Right. He's taking lessons. Once he's identified in the media, then more tips start coming in, and we start finding information about, really how unseasoned he was as a violent criminal. I mean, he had definitely had his criminal past. It was mostly bank fraud, credit card fraud, other types of frauds, just in order for him to get money. But it was never violent, or at least he was never identified as violent. He was learning. In fact, he was asking people along the way for advice, friends and things like that, on how they would do something like this. But most of his friends thought he was crazy and it was just a joke.
Well, when Jamie is brought into the conversation, you have a few more steps to go before we talk to Jamie. But that would be one of the things, Jamie, that I'm going to ask you about, is the fact that he's gone from these con level fraud type cases, which are the kind of things that I investigated, to this violence. And just hold that thought. But, I'm definitely very curious as to if you had seen that before in his personality. Lance, tell us what happens next.
Sure. So we're gathering information all over the place, and it's obvious that Jason is no longer in the state of Arizona. while Phoenix PD is running with the autopsy of the victim and all the other areas where we gather evidence here, and really they're interviewing more of the Arizona-based witnesses. The FBI, my side, we're working heavily on the fugitive aspect and everything out of Arizona. And what we find is that Jason really, he's not from Arizona. He was not a local here. He had lived here for a short period of time when he was kind of nomadic, kind of moved from residence to residence during a couple-year period between Utah, Texas, Arizona, and California. But he wasn't from Phoenix. So we started jumping in on taking the lead on this part of the case. I mentioned that he was at a hotel. We learned from that hotel that he had the room reserved for a few more nights. I think the crime occurred November 29th. He was supposed to check out that day, November 29th. About 2 hours after the homicide, he calls the hotel and says he can't make it back in time. He needs to extend his stay a couple days. So they run his credit card and they talk about how he seemed very anxious over the phone. He came back later that evening and likely removed stuff from his room, although we don't have any video to show that. But when we ultimately got into his room 2 or 3 days later, the room was completely empty and he was gone. So once we identified who he wasn't there at the hotel anymore. We're looking for where he might have been. So we had cell phone records, credit card records, bank records. We're searching through all those, and we quickly identify $2,000 cash deposit in Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas. And also from cell phone evidence, we see that he's no longer in the state of Arizona. This was a while ago, 2004, so kind of in the early phases of what cell phone evidence can do in an investigation. But it was coming to us pretty quick. And we were looking for the BMW because we still had not located that as well. So during all those calls, we delve in heavily to the cell phone information. And what we find is that really helps the case is that when the homicide occurred, Jason's phone was using cell towers in the area of the movie theater there in Ahwatukee. So what it does, and a lot of people, there's a lot of misinformation about what cell phone evidence can do, especially back in 2004 when it was kind of in its early infancy. Basically, all it did was tell us that a cell phone used a cell tower in an area. It wasn't equipped with GPS at the time, not these type of cell phones. So I could tell that it was in a roughly 2 to 3 mile area around the movie theater, but I couldn't tell you if he was right there at the movie theater, but it did put him in the area. And then we saw that in the immediate aftermath, he starts using cell towers around Phoenix. And what we find is he leaves the area of the homicide and goes to the Sky Harbor Airport, the major international airport in Phoenix, then goes to the area of 24-hour fitness, a gym. He worked out a lot. He liked the gyms, but he goes in there. We pull surveillance video there. He comes in, it appears that he goes in the locker room, changes clothes. He may shower, we're not sure, leaves a bag inside the 24-hour fitness, and likely in the locker, and then leaves for about 30 to 45 minutes. Ultimately comes back to that 24-hour fitness, retrieves that bag. There's nothing left in the locker room of his, and he leaves. He goes to the airport, pulls surveillance video all around the airport. He goes into a parking garage, but never exits his car at the BMW, and then ultimately leaves the Sky Harbor area airport, and then eventually starts heading north towards Las Vegas. In the 35 to 40 minutes after the homicide, he makes 40 plus calls. So more than one call a minute. And a lot of those are to his brother, David. It's giving us a lot of information. The next day, after we gather all this, we're quickly building enough probable cause on Jason for the homicide. So on December 4th, we obtain a grand jury indictment through Maricopa County court system for one count of homicide with Jason as the subject. That same day, we also get a UFAP warrant, and that's a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. That's what UFAP stands for. And that makes him a federal fugitive as well and allows the FBI to use all of our resources in order to find him and arrest him based on the local warrant.
Yeah, and can we talk a little bit about that? Because this is what you were talking about when you were talking about the partnership between the local police department and the FBI and those resources. So if this was just a case that was being worked by the Phoenix Police Department and he's now fled and he's in Nevada or California or wherever, talk about that difficulty of being able to do that as quickly as you were able to do it with the FBI's participation.
Right. So if you're a local detective and you're working a case with a subject who's likely out of your jurisdiction, you can definitely get the help of other local departments in other jurisdictions and try to work it. However, it might not be a priority for those other departments. And, the arrest is one thing, but in this case, We have the BMW that we're looking for. We have the weapon we're still looking for. We have tons of evidence we need to collect and gather. In fact, we've got a full-on fugitive investigation now. We don't know exactly where he is. We're getting close once he stops moving, but we don't know exactly where he is. So you need somebody to interview the gun store owner, for example, family members, friends in other states, things like that. So when the FBI is partnered with the local department and we get a UFAP warrant, or we have a justification for a federal investigation, which here with the Hobbs Act that I discussed earlier, we had clearly had that, then we're all in. So it's just me making a call to an FBI office in Salt Lake or Las Vegas, and they're jumping on search warrants, collecting evidence, everything they need to do. And it's just as much of a priority for them as it is for us, hopefully.
That really explains why I always, get upset when I see TV shows and movies where the FBI doesn't play well with others. I mean, this is what we're good at, working with our law enforcement partners in just this type of situation.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that, Jerry. In my career, if I didn't have a partnership with the local departments in and around Phoenix, we would not have been successful. But at the same time, I really feel like the FBI helped make cases for the local departments as well. And it was that partnership, that liaison building there that makes it. I mean, if I came on a scene ever and I showed my FBI credentials and I said, this is the FBI and we're taking over, yeah, I would be persona non grata. I mean, I would not be allowed back in a crime scene probably in Phoenix. And it never happened like that. It was always a partnership. We worked everything jointly for the most part until we decided what's the smartest route, federal prosecution, local prosecution. And if you have a great relationship with each other, it usually works out pretty well.
Good.
So we're gathering, like I said, a lot of information about Jason. We find he has storage units in Las Vegas. He's got storage units in Austin. He had a lot of family members at the time in Orange County, California. We still have not found the BMW. We saw it in a lot of surveillance videos as he was fleeing Arizona, but we have not located it. It's not that we can see at any of those storage units. We don't see it at any of the residences as well that we're watching. So there's a lot of surveillance going on at this point. We don't know where he's going to pop up or where he's going to show, but we're zeroing in on Orange County. That's where the cell phone records are directing us. That's where credit card and bank records are directing us. And we're getting closer. So this is where, while we have a great relationship with local departments, we often have different priorities, different perceived priorities in an investigation, different investigative strategy, I would say. And in this case, it happened here. So we had our subject identified, and he was a violent subject, just executed this armored car guard and fled the state. So Phoenix Police Department, their priority was identifying and arresting this individual, which was our priority as well. But they felt like their brass, their management, felt that they needed to get the word out to the community that the crime has been solved. This is our subject, and to be on the lookout for this subject. It was my opinion, and I would say that our office is the FBI's opinion, that we should hold off on telling everyone in the world that Jason did this until we have Jason in custody. The best way to prevent this from happening again is to get him in custody. And we were certain if they gave us a couple days, Jason would be in custody. And if we were allowed to do it without tipping our hand.
Because at this point, Jason doesn't know that you've identified him.
He's likely felt that he got away scot-free. I'm sure he's looking over his shoulder. I'm sure he's being careful, but he wasn't chased out of Arizona. He went on his own accord. He had planned this, so I'm sure he felt like he did a pretty good job trying to avoid detection, but we were definitely zeroing in on him. So I remember distinctly one morning, Tom Kalesa, the Phoenix detective, and a couple other detectives from his homicide squad, and myself and a couple agents from my violent crime squad, we had breakfast, as most agents and detectives do together. And we were sharing notes and sharing priorities. And I remember Tom telling me that he was getting a lot of pressure from his management to do a press release and let everyone know that Jason is their subject that we're looking for. I remember that conversation really well. I'll always think back to that conversation. I remember I remember telling Tom and the rest of the Phoenix detectives, give me 48 hours. Give us 48 hours and we'll have him in custody. And that's the safest thing you can do for the community, to get him in custody. I was younger, like I said at the time. If I had a few more years on me, I would have escalated that much more quickly to executive management and have them hash it out. And I didn't. I believed that, calmer heads would prevail and we wouldn't be doing a press conference. Well, later that day, Phoenix Police Department's executive management chose to issue a press release with Jason's photo and identifiers, and that opened Pandora's box. So the media in Phoenix started calling every Brown they could find in Orange County and in the Salt Lake area, looking for relatives, looking for Jason, looking for anybody who would give them a quote for their story. What we determined, and Jamie could probably speak to this a little better, is that I believe somebody called a family member in Orange County. I don't think it was David. It was maybe an aunt.
It was a cousin. It was my dad's sister's daughter. It was a cousin. Yeah.
Okay. So they reached out, like they're doing their job. They're just trying to get more of a story. They reached out, and ultimately word got to David, I believe, and then to Jason. At the time, Jason was staying with Jamie at Jamie's place. It was in Rancho Santa Margarita. Is that right, Jamie?
Rancho Santa Margarita. I had moved to Rancho Santa Margarita from Laguna Beach for a year for my son to get residency to play basketball at a private school there. And I had to live there for a year. So the area was an unfamiliar area to me, as it was to Jason, because nobody knew Jason there. No one knew myself there. No one knew us there.
So word got to Jason, who at the time was staying with Jamie in Rancho Santa Margarita, California. And the word was, hey, what's up with this arrest warrant out of Arizona?
This might be a good time for Jamie to come on. So Jamie, I take it when Jason showed up at your house for a visit, you had absolutely no idea what was going on. Tell us about that day when he showed up.
Okay. What had happened, I have to back up a little bit so that the story makes sense, is that immediately after the robbery, I received a phone call from Jason to let me know that he was going to come visit me. And I said, when? And she said, I'll come see you soon. For Christmas. And all of a sudden there was a knock at the door, and it was Jason, and he had a lot of luggage with him, and he liked to surprise me, and he surprised me. And he came on in the door, and we hugged, and he picked up my son from school, and we spent the whole week together, Jerry. The entire week. We went out to dinner every night. My son had gone to his dad's house for the week for visitation, and Jason and I spent a wild week together. We went out every night, saw all his friends. We had a great week. The only indicators looking back now, because I'm a very observant person, we were raised by a sociopathic narcissist who trained us in criminal behavior. And we were always taught to watch our surroundings, our back. So we were very aware. The only three things that I noticed that were different, Jason's behavior looking back now, the first is that he kept insisting on locking the front door. And there were a couple instances where he was very upset with me for not locking the front door. The second was he was listening to some very erratic rap music with a lot of murder, gun, cuss words in it that I had never heard Jason listen to before in my life. And that was a little disturbing to me. And the third one was, all of us Browns are race car drivers. We like to drive fast, and we like nice cars. And I was speeding one night coming home late, and he yelled at me like I'd never heard him yell at me to slow the F down. And I looked at him like, since when are you telling me to slow down? But those were the only three indicators that I saw of Jason's behavior being not any different from how Jason was. He wasn't looking behind his shoulder. He was not in, hiding. He was out in the open. We were visiting friends and eating out and enjoying our life.
You're telling us about, that you're not used to him listening and watching violent things and the cursing. Why don't you talk a little bit about your upbringing and the fact that Jason at one point was a missionary, which of course none of this activity would be something that you would associate with a Mormon missionary.
Exactly. Well, that goes back to our childhood. We were raised Mormon, but like I had just mentioned earlier, my father was a sociopath and a narcissist and a criminal. And that behavior, that genetic gene was passed on to Jason. And as hard as Jason tried to escape the grasp of my father by going on a mission, he struggled and tried to do the right thing, except his inner demons took a hold of him. He was unable to escape them. He was a wonderful missionary. He was a wonderful brother. He was a wonderful friend. He was an amazing father to my son who has lost his father and my own father who disappeared 10 years before Jason's disappearance. And he was a great uncle. But there was another side to Jason. And often there are two different sides to people that are sociopaths and narcissists. Jason served his mission successfully. Jason was married in the Mormon temple to a wonderful woman who was a good friend of mine from college. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. And when that marriage dissolved, Jason started on a very dark path. It was at that moment after the divorce that Jason was no longer Jason. His life had turned into a life of drugs, alcohol, women, and money, getting more. Jason was abused by my father. I truly believe that my father tried to beat the bad out of Jason. He knew that Jason was stealing at a young age, and he saw that Jason was going to be just like him. And Jason, out of all four of us, Jason received probably the worst out of all of us as far as the beatings went. Oftentimes I would try to pull my father off of Jason to save Jason and get hurt trying to save him. But often victims of abuse, when they don't deal with it, they use tactics to numb. And Jason did just that. First, he started with experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Jason had never drank alcohol or done drugs till after the divorce. Then he started with the toys and shopping and getting the gratification that came from others by buying people things and by being the life of the party, because he didn't get that. He didn't get that from my father. So he got that from his friends and people that he met. Jason did not have any signs of anger when he was younger. But as he grew older, he became extremely angry. My dad said that he would pay for his student loans when he attended the Monterey Institute of International Business Study in California. It's a private institution that you can only get into with certain grades and speak a language fluently to be able to apply. And Jason received his master's, I believe, at the age of 25 years old in international business. My father said he would pay the student loans and never did. He did a lot of things to Jason. He used Jason's identity. He used all of our social security numbers. I think over the years, it took a toll on Jason. Jason was his little minion. Jason felt, it's called the betrayal bond. And when somebody that is betraying you or abusing you, you feel connected to them and you want to help them and please them at the same time. And Jason had that with my father. And as he grew older, he hated John Brown. And I believe, this is my own opinion, that my dad's disappearance was linked to Jason somehow. The way that he acted when my dad disappeared, the signs were just indicative to me of someone who had no emotion or feeling any longer.
Do you think that Jason helped your father disappear?
No, I think he harmed. I believe that my father was harmed. There's some information in my book where I had found some evidence that had led me to believe that Jason was involved in it somehow. Otherwise, that evidence would have never been at his house under his bed. So.
And when did your father disappear?
He disappeared 10 years before Jason's disappearance. So 26 years ago. Jason has been on the run for 16 years. My father disappeared 10 years before that.
Well, let's go back to Jason showing up at your house.
This was about the 6th or 7th day that Jason had spent with me. And Jason had been playing golf, I believe, with my brother David. And Jason called me and asked me if the front door of the house was open. And I said, no, it's not, but I'll be right there to open it. I said, why? And he said, oh, my sprinkler system went off at my home in Arizona and I need to go, but I'll be back. So can you meet me at the house? I said, absolutely. I met him at the house He hugged me. I asked how his day was. He very calmly walked into the other room, not in a hurry, in any rush, and slowly started putting all of his belongings in his bag. He walked out to the car. He got something to drink out of the refrigerator. We talked. He loaded up his car. He came back in and talked to me. He said he'd be back. We went outside. He gave me a hug. I said, when are you coming back, Jason? And he goes, I'll be back real soon. And he gave me a second hug, which was a tighter hug. And I watched the car drive off. Then I went back into the house. My son had come home from school, and then I was cooking dinner, and I received a phone call from the sister of the cousin that had called into the FBI later on that evening. And she said, turn on the news. Jason is all over the news. And I shut my son's door and I walked into the living room, and sure enough, all over every single news channel was Jason Brown's face, wanted for murder and armed robbery. I instantly went into mama bear mode and wanted to protect my son from this, and got on the phone and tried to reach out to my brother David to find out what was going on. And as you can imagine, I was in a state of shock.
But you are looking at the TV, and you see that Jason is now wanted for murder. What happens next?
Yes. So now I'm in a state of panic, and I proceeded to pour myself a glass of wine and try to calm my nerves down. This went on for about an hour or two. The phone is ringing off the hook. This is at a time where we had home phones, and the cell phone, the home phone, it was too much for me. So I took my Jack Russell and I walked around the block to get some fresh air and try to calm my nerves. And I noticed a car, as Browns, as I told you earlier, we're taught to notice everything. And I noticed a government vehicle parked with a person in it. And so I looked at the vehicle, I looked at the person, I walked on, and as I rounded another corner, I saw another one. And then it registered in my head, they're surrounding my house, and they're going to think that Jason is my son, and my son could possibly be killed. And I ran back to the house, and before I could get my hand on the front door, agents jumped out and took me to the ground and brought me in the house. They busted into my son's bedroom door. They separated us and interrogated us as they should. And I think the most traumatic part was watching my son go through that. I think that was probably so difficult because he had just lost his grandfather. He had just lost his dad when he was 5 years old, and now his uncle. It was just all too much. It was surreal.
How old was your son at the time?
He was 15 years old. And I sat there with the agents and told the agents that they asked, what kind of car was Jason driving? And I said, a silver BMW. They said, which direction did he go? And I told them a different direction. They said, what time did he leave, Jamie? And I told them a different time, because I didn't know if Jason had done this. He acted so normal. I thought somebody must have done this or framed him. I don't know. I need to talk to Jason before I turn him into the FBI. We were taught to protect each other as children. That's all we had was each other. And as an FBI related to me later on, a few days later, he said, Jamie, we understand. It's a family's natural reaction to protect their own. And a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people say, you should have turned him in immediately, but you have to understand, I'm in a state of shock. I've already lost, my son's father, my father, and now my best friend and my brother, Jason. So I had also taken some Xanax before the FBI had arrived. So I was I wouldn't say intoxicated, because my adrenaline was revving at such a high rate. I was in shock. I probably could have drank 10 bottles of wine, but I told the FBI a lie, and the FBI, correct me if I'm wrong, they did an all points bulletin on Jason for a silver BMW going in a certain direction at a certain time. Lance, is that correct?
So, yes, initially we were looking for the BMW, but Jamie, we expect people to lie to us. So, especially in fugitive cases like this, like we knew what you told us. We didn't take it completely to heart. So we were looking for everything still.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next day I woke up, I think I had slept maybe an hour or two. I had to get my son to school and still function as a mother. As I've learned early on in life, just, dress it up, put the smiley face on and just act like everything's okay, Jamie. So I did just that. And I talked to my brother, David. He came over to the house and he said, Jamie, you need to save yourself. You cannot save Jason. You need to save yourself. You need to tell the FBI exactly what happened.
David is giving you this information. Had the FBI reached out to David and had David talked to them about his connections with Jason?
Lance, I don't believe that anybody had talked to David at this point. Is that correct?
No, the same day that we were searching your house for Jason, we talked to David as well. And then that was the first of multiple conversations with David that is another part of the story, Jerry.
Right. But initially it was the initial contract was made with me because of the cousin that made the phone call, Jerry. That's how they knew where Jason was. Or they would have never known where Jason was if that cousin hadn't have called. Or it would have taken them quite some time to figure it out because I had moved recently. Okay, so David said, you need to, quote unquote, save yourself, Jamie. You can't save Jason now. So I made a phone call to an ex-boyfriend. I wanted the FBI to meet at my ex-boyfriend's office in Laguna Beach in his conference room with the FBI agents. I think there was probably 5 or 6 there. I can't recall. There was quite a large table of them. And just in case I needed an attorney and he wanted to be there. He wasn't actually in the room. I was just using his conference room. And there I related the story of exactly what had happened, that I had lied to them and why I had lied to them. And I told them the truth the following morning.
Here's where it's a whirlwind because now it's an active flight fugitive investigation. We know he knows we're out onto him and it makes it a lot more hard. So at this point, the cat's out of the bag. So we're interviewing family members, friends, associates, everybody. We're not holding back. And what we find is that he has a Cadillac Escalade that does have a tracking system in it, but he ripped that out or disabled that as he left Jamie's place. We are still on credit card statements, bank accounts, phone, all that. Oh, he turns his phone off or breaks it also. That never comes back on again. We do get a ping on a credit card usage at a gas station just south of Orange County within a few hours. Agents go straight there, pull the surveillance video, and we realize he's in the Cadillac. So we can see it on the video. So we're no longer looking for the BMW. We believe we're looking for the Cadillac. So Jamie's initial statements might have slowed us, but it wasn't the reason. We couldn't find him. He uses an ATM in San Diego, not far from the U.S.-Mexico border there in Tijuana. And then he does something else there that we don't realize for a while. And then we don't hear from him or we don't see him for a long time. We've got the bulletin out all around California, local authorities, federal authorities, everybody's looking for him. He doesn't pop up again. No credit card usage, no phone records, nothing like that. But like I said earlier, we're still surveilling several locations, storage units in Texas, storage unit in Las Vegas, and a P.O. box in Orange County that he often used. Well, it was a few days later, and we see that a package is delivered to that P.O. box, and it's delivered to David in David's name, Jason's brother, but it came from San Diego. So while he was down there in San Diego, when he used the ATM, he also sent a package back home to David. And that package contained all types of things that you would think might be useful for somebody on the run, but he sent anyway. It had a laptop. There were some two-way radios in it. There were a lot of discs and images about Jason's life. Most of them were party pictures, skiing pictures on his motorcycles and toys. He sent clothes. He sent a camera. He sent a PlayStation and a few other items.
And David voluntarily provided you with the contents of this box?
No, it wasn't voluntary. So we knew that package was delivered, and we were watching to see if anybody would come pick it up, just to see what kind of corroboration we're getting. I can't remember if David picks that up or if it's just left there at the post office box and never retrieved. Ultimately, another package comes in to that same post office box. This one's from Portland area. And it is also a package of Jason's items, more clothes, golf equipment, this time a gun also, but not the 45 caliber Glock that was used in the homicide. This was a 9mm Glock that was actually David's. That was in David's house that Jason must have stolen from David. According to David, he must have stolen it from David while he was down there after the homicide, before he fled from Orange County. So he sent that back to him as well. The 45 caliber Glock has never been found. That was not in any of the packages.
Just to interject, I remember what happened. The package was delivered you were doing surveillance at on the post office, because you did have David and Jason's PO address. So when the package did come, we had to go with the FBI over to the Laguna Beach Police Department. And because opening someone's mail is a federal offense, we had to give permission for you to open the box. So we were there for both of the packages to be opened.
And so the second package, the one that came from Portland,
yes,
that also proved helpful, because ultimately we found the Cadillac Escalade. It was parked in the Portland International Airport parking lot in long-term parking. A couple of the windows were broken out. FBI did a full crime scene analysis on that, including DNA and fingerprints, and did not identify anybody else's DNA or fingerprints in that other than Jason's. The license plate was removed, and it took us it might have taken us almost a month to locate that there, but there were no records of Jason or any aliases that we knew Jason used taking any flights out of Portland International Airport.
The GPS system was also ripped out of the vehicle, and a window was smashed to probably make it look like it was stolen. My father, Jerry, had taught us that if you had a stolen car, you could hide it in long-term parking of an airport for up to 30 days before it would be discovered. So that behavior is definitely indicative of something that Jason would do, because the car was found a month later. The day, I think it was on my birthday, January 17th or 16th, the car was found.
And it seems strange, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this, that he first went to San Diego to give the impression that he might have fled into Mexico, and then he goes to Portland to give the impression that he might have fled to Canada.
Canada, exactly. But this behavior, Jerry, you have to understand, this is all training from a very young age from our father. All of Jason's calculated moves this is all learned behavior from our father. So when Jason had done something, I knew why he was doing it.
Very interesting. So what do you do with this information, Lance?
We are following leads left and right all over the place. And there's all kind of theories as to what Jason might have done. Was the car in the airport parking lot to make us think he took a flight? Did he take a flight? Did he cross the border into Canada, which makes more sense than Mexico? He speaks fluent French from his studies and his studies in his Mormon mission to Paris. So there's all different directions to go. We are still surveilling storage units as well, both in Texas and in Las Vegas. And we have not found the BMW. So one night we get reports from our teams in Austin, Texas, that there are two people unloading Jason's storage unit in Austin. We arrest and detain those two. The FBI team arrests and detains those two. And it turns out to be David, Jason's brother, and one of Jason's close friends. And they're interviewed that night, and they say they're just removing Jason's stuff so they can sell it and make some money from some of the items that are in their motorcycles and other types of things. Ultimately, the same thing happens in Las Vegas to the storage unit there. We end up doing a search warrant there, and we still don't find the BMW. It wasn't until maybe a couple weeks later that we get some reports that the BMW is parked near David's house. We ultimately confront David with that fact. And after weeks of telling us he has no idea where the BMW is, he admits that it is Jason's BMW there and that he picked it up from Jason's storage unit in Las Vegas not long after the homicide, not long after Jason fleeing anyway. had it completely detailed and cleaned, which would have destroyed any evidence from the crime scene that we were looking for, and then had it driven back to Orange County, where he parked it away from his residence. So that act ultimately resulted in David being charged with tampering, a federal charge of tampering, and being convicted of that charge a few months later.
He didn't tell you about the fact that he knew where the BMW was and that he had retrieved it. Did he tell you about the storage locker?
No, I did not tell us about the Las Vegas storage unit. I don't believe it. At some point in one of the interviews he did. I can't remember if the earlier ones he didn't, but the BMW was critical because that came directly from the crime scene. Jason fled on the bike to that parking lot area and likely got into the BMW immediately after the homicide. So it could have contained evidence that would have linked Jason to the scene. So David's, actively lying to us, telling us that he didn't know where it was, while during those lies, he was actively hiding it, cleaning out the BMW. That resulted in the charge.
I can imagine. Now, Jamie, this is the same brother David that told you not to lie to...
I know.
Yeah.
Exactly. And David, again, we're going back to the sins of the father being laid on to the children, because David had learned the same behavior from my father. Do not cooperate with the police. Do not cooperate with the FBI. In our household, we always had sheriff, police. My dad was going to jail, and we were taught that they were bad. So never cooperate with them. I believe that David was asked by Lance, David, do you know, is the BMW, have you been to Las Vegas, Nevada? Is the BMW in Las Vegas? And David said no. And that is a true statement. It was not in Las Vegas. It was in Henderson, Nevada. So my dad had always taught us that when you're asked a question by the FBI or the police, that you must answer that question exactly verbatim to their question. Do not give them any additional information. David did play a cat and mouse game with Lance. He definitely did. David thought that he was above the law. He was not cooperative with Lance at all. He avoided them. He did not return their phone calls. He's the one that made it difficult on himself. If he had just come forth and been honest and cooperated with Lance, I'm sure that none of this would have happened to David and his life. But David thought that he was above the law and that he could get away with it and that he did not need to cooperate with the authorities. So I do find it interesting that he did tell me to turn myself in and to be honest, and then he did exactly the opposite.
And Lance, tell us about the difference between the cooperation of David and Jamie. I mean, Jamie's here recording this with you. So can we talk about the cooperation and the relationship between you two?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And Jamie, please chime in when you need to. So,
of course.
I mean, it's hard. So it's hard on the families of people who commit crimes, right? I mean, obviously the focus is on the victim's family. And in this case, it should be on Keith and his family. I mean, they went through the worst. But I always also, as an agent, I always looked at the family of the suspect and had some feeling for them as well. They didn't ask for this. Most of the time, they didn't help their family member commit this crime or anything like that. They didn't ask for it, but they're in it. So as an FBI agent, especially as a fugitive agent, you're always trying to determine which one are they? Are they a cooperative family member that wants to help us because, they want to do the right thing? Or did they help maybe commit the crime? Are they helping actively hide the fugitive? There's a line there. And with Jamie, it takes a while to get to where you need to be to do the right thing, especially with blood relations. I mean, blood is thicker than water. So initially, like Jamie described, she told us he was in the BMW and he was really in the Cadillac. We expect that. I mean, that's something it's hard to get past. It probably took Jamie, my impression of Jamie is that it took you a while to get to the point where we built some trust, that you saw that I wasn't after you at all, that we're really just out for justice for Keith's family and we're really looking for Jason. It was the same with David. I wasn't after David. I wanted to find Jason. David took active steps to avoid me finding Jason. So that's what ended up in the charge. I felt like Jamie, it took some years But when you got there, you got there. And our subsequent interviews and our talks after that seemed to be more cooperative and more trusting. And we started to open up a little bit more with each other. And that evolved to this.
And Jerry, Lance would fly out periodically from Arizona to meet with me up in Park City, Utah, just to ask questions, update me on new leads on the information. I really started to gain trust with Lance. I knew that in my heart, I did not want to help the FBI because my heart does not want my brother to be caught and killed. You know, I do want my brother to be tried for this crime, but my heart protecting my brother, but my conscience and my head wants to do the right thing and cooperate with the FBI and give them as much information as possible at any time. And I think there's just a relationship that Lance and I have, a very open relationship. And Lance understands me. I think I mentioned in my book that nobody ever asks me how I'm doing. Nobody ever asks me when they run into me on the street and they haven't seen me, or just someone that knows about the case or my family. They never say, "Hey, Jamie, how are you doing? What's going on?" The very first thing that comes out of anybody's mouth for the last 16 years of my life is, "Where's your brother? Have they found your brother? Your brother's on the FBI." I mean, that's the very first thing anybody ever asks me. And Lance is probably the only person that asks me. The very first thing he says to me is, "How are you doing, Jamie? How are things going in your life?" And then we get into a conversation. So I think having that relationship with somebody has helped me to open up more, where probably in the past I would be a little more closed off and guarded and protective. When he retired from the force a week before my book came out, Lance sent me a text message. "Good luck with your book, Jamie, and everything you do. Your willingness to do the right thing is refreshing." And I continue to do the right thing in supporting the FBI. As many text messages and horrible emails and instant messages I get from all over the world from people telling me that I should be in prison, that I'm just like my brother and father. I'm involved in the murder just as they are. I have blood on my hands. I know in my heart that I'm doing the right thing by writing this book and being on this podcast and cooperating with the FBI. It's a very difficult situation to be in, but I know in my heart that I'm doing the right thing by cooperating with the FBI and the new agent on the case.
Well, Lance, why don't you bring us up to date? Because this is kind of a different case. You know, usually when we review a case, it's fully adjudicated, but this is still an active, open, fugitive investigation.
Yeah, in 2007, Jason Brown was added to the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. He was added right alongside Osama bin Laden at the time. Seems like a little bit of a contradiction in type of fugitives, but Jason was added for a reason. He is an unusual fugitive, speaks fluent French, masters in international business, adept at using fake IDs, wanted for a very violent crime that he could commit again, likely an international fugitive. And the FBI's top 10 list is amazing at getting attention focused on all those fugitives internationally. So the amount of tips we get is unbelievable. He was featured on Dateline, on America's Most Wanted, on full shows of those. America's Most Wanted producers told me that they got more tips on Jason Derek Brown than any fugitive in their run. He's probably very close to that on the FBI's top 10 list too. I would estimate, and I don't have an exact number in front of me, but I would estimate we've received 12 to 15,000 tips on where he is. Not one credible tip. There have been a few that have raised their eyebrows. Every one of them we've investigated and resolved if we can. Multiple people that looked a lot like Brown that we weren't able to determine whether they were or not until we reviewed their fingerprints. He looks a lot like Sean Penn, we've been told, and you can see that in the wet red hoodie sweatshirt. We've detained Sean Penn's body doubles on multiple occasions. We've never detained Sean Penn, luckily, but everybody else. And we're going to continue to look for him. You usually only come off the FBI list if you're determined to have died or we catch you. So there are some exceptions to that, but we're going to keep looking. The current agents that are on the case are committed, and the FBI is committed to getting every one of those top 10 fugitives. There are a couple quick stories, a couple unusual points, Jerry. One was while he was fleeing, I said nobody's heard from him. However, when he was here in Phoenix, days before the homicide, he was out in the middle of the desert practicing his shooting. He wasn't a very safe shooter, obviously, and he was shooting in the open desert. Some of his rounds went into a campsite where a kid and his father were camping and impacted their pickup truck, put a hole in his driver's side door. The dad was pretty upset about that and drove an ATV over to him and demanded that he pay for the truck damage. Well, that person was Jason. Jason took out a paper plate that was at the campsite and wrote down his license plate, his name, his address in Salt Lake City that wasn't really his address, and his phone number, and told him he'd pay for the damage and apologize to his kid. And then probably before he fled Orange County, this likely would have been while he was either in Henderson or Las Vegas or staying with Jamie, he sent a $1,300 cashier's check and a $200 Toys R Us gift certificate for the kid to the witness in Phoenix. So really a dichotomy. There's somebody who can execute an armored car guard with 6 rounds to the head and then have the compassion to send a Toys R Us gift card to a kid that he scared accidentally while shooting.
My father was the same way. So narcissists and sociopaths have to be nice. They have to show that loving side. Then they have this other side to them. And Jason was exactly the mirror image of my father. Exactly. My father could go in and do the most horrific crime, commit a horrific crime to somebody. And then in the next second, he's buying me an ice cream and telling me it's all going to be okay. It's a sociopath that we're dealing with. And I think that Jason's compulsive, obsessive, sex addiction, narcissistic, sociopathic, gambling, addictive behavior was the mirror image of my father. And this is something my father would do.
Going back to the 1994 disappearance of Jamie's father, and Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, he didn't really go around and say goodbye to everybody before he disappeared. His car wasn't found for months later until it was found on the Mexico-U.S. border in Brownsville, Texas.
When my dad disappeared, we usually had family dinner on Monday nights, and my father didn't show up for dinner. And his girlfriend at the time was very upset because my dad was always running around on her and cheating. And so we waited as long as we could. We ate our dinner and left. Later that night, his girlfriend had tried to break into his house, called me and said, "Your dad never came home last night." So I went over to my dad's house because this is just another daily drama in the Brown household. I showed up at the house and a Ryder moving truck is in front of the house, Jerry. And my brothers are there, David and Jason, and they are moving everything out of my father's house. They're throwing his clothes in the trash can. And I said, "What are you doing?" And it said, quote unquote, "Dad said if he's not back in 48 hours to get everything out of the house, he's never coming back." And I fell to the ground in tears, crying, "Why are you doing this? Please stop. He's coming back." He had come by my house on a Sunday. He had honked his horn. He had one of those Cobra kit cars that was super loud. I had just gone from church and he was honking, "Do you want to go for a Sunday ride?" And I screamed out the window at him, "I'm sleeping. Leave me alone. You need to call before you come over. That's so rude." And I slammed the door. And before I slammed the door, he said, "I was just coming by, Jamie, to see if everything's okay." And I said, "Everything's okay, Dad. Everything's okay with John." This was my second husband. "And Shane, everything's fine. Just leave us alone. I'll talk to you later." And he waved, blew a kiss, and drove off. And that was the last time I ever saw him. I think if I had gone with him, he may have given me some indication of him leaving or being involved in something. But 2 days later, Dave and Jason were moving everything out of his house, throwing his clothes in the trash. And they were laughing. They were carrying on a normal conversation. They had no emotion about any of it. And I can't even describe to you what that is like, to watch my brothers with the look in their eyes of just cold stone, emotionless, unempathetic, just nothing.
It sounds to me like you are wavering between there's a possibility that Jason and your father are somewhere together and the strong possibility that Jason and your brother did something to your father, killed your father, and that's why they knew he wasn't coming back, and that's why they knew they could destroy.
Exactly. And they had no emotion, which led me to believe either A, they did something, or B, that they knew where he was, and that's why it wasn't bothering them.
So this violent tendency of the non-violent tendency that we attributed to Jason and the execution of this armored car robber may not be true. Lance, what do you think about this possible theory? Jason being involved in the actual disappearance and possible death of his father.
So there were also a lot of people that didn't like Jamie's father. There were some reputed organized crime ties. There were some gambling debts. Jamie in her book tells a story about them going to Tijuana to bring back large amounts of money. There were some people who Jamie's father didn't make friends with. So there are a list of suspects there. While that's a possibility, Jamie would probably know far better than I would. I do believe Jason and David are closely connected. If one's involved in something, the other probably is involved as well, especially back then when they were growing up together. So there are a lot of theories out there. One is that Jason's dead. That's why we haven't received any corroborated sightings in so many years. And he was described by several as depressed, sick of sleeping on the couch. He probably sees the world crumbling around him. So Jamie and other family members consented to having their DNA taken by us. And we created a familial DNA profile that's entered in the NamUs database, which is a North American Missing and Unidentified Remains database. So if remains are ever found and it's run through that database, which is the typical process, but up to this point, no remains have been found and identified. I think it's very likely that he's using his French, his ability to have fake IDs, his charismatic nature, and maybe his knowledge of the LDS Church to hide internationally and get the help he needs from others through typical cons that he's used.
If there's someone listening to this who believes that they know where Jason is, what would you like for them to do?
They need to call the FBI office or any FBI office where they are, submit a tip online, fbi.gov, call local police department, but the FBI would be the first call because it is a high priority for the FBI and we would jump on it right away. His photograph and FBI wanted poster, I'm sure, Jerry, are posted on your website. You can also find them on the FBI's website, but don't delay. This is what it's going to take to find Jason, is somebody hearing this podcast, seeing a media report and realizing, oh, that's so-and-so who has told me their name is this and that this is their history and none of that's true. We need that tip. That's the tip that's going to ultimately bring Jason to justice.
And Jamie, I'd like for you to give us your, last thoughts about this. Do you believe that Jason is still alive? And if he were to contact you and reach out to you or David, what would you do?
I believe that Jason is still alive. I know my brother Jason. I know he has a great deal of love for himself. He gets an adrenaline rush off of this, just like my father did. Running from the law, being wanted, it's a game to him. It's a game to Jason. And he's very smart. Even his best friend said Jason Brown is one of the smartest people I know. I believe that he is alive and he's in an obvious place. He's not out in the middle of Canada or in France. He's living amongst us. He's probably had plastic surgery. When he came to my house, that was another thing he mentioned to me, that he wanted to connect him with my plastic surgeon and get some work done. And I believe he's altered his look. If Jason were to call or contact me, the first thing I would do is hang up and call the FBI immediately, even though my heart would want to talk to him. The very first thing I did, Jerry, is when I went to meet with the FBI the next day and tell them the truth about what happened, I changed my cell phone number and I changed my home number. So I did that so he was unable to contact me. And people ask me every day to this day, 16 years later, in all honesty, straight to my face, have you talked to Jason lately? Does Jason call you? Have you talked to him? One more thing I wanted to bring up that wasn't covered in this podcast is Jason addicted to a drug called GHB. It's the FDA took it off the market and now it's a illegal substance. But when the FBI raided my house, they had found water bottles and it looked like Windex. And I had thought when Jason was staying with me that week that the maid was putting Windex water bottles under the sink. But after the FBI had raided the house, I had found some hidden in the couch. It was hidden everywhere. I think that Jason didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to go commit a murder. He was definitely on something to be able to go and commit an act like this. It wasn't just his normal everyday behavior. He was definitely under the influence of drugs. I think as far as Jason goes, that living life on the run eventually will wear you down at some point. He'll eventually slip up. And I believe that that's what the FBI is counting on. Having lived with my father when he was older, I saw my dad starting to get sloppy in his lies, sloppy in his criminal actions. I believe that Jason will eventually slip up and he will be found.
Well, I want to thank you, Jamie, for agreeing to come on to tell us more about Jason. I want to remind everyone that you've just published your memoir called Center of Attention. And it goes through how your father, your first husband, and your brother, and all of these losses and disappearances and absence, how they affected your life. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy. Thank you again for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome, Jerry. Thank you for having me.
And I will have a link to your book in the show notes for this episode. So, Lance, we're at the point of every case review where I try to get to know a little bit more about the case agent. So I'm going to ask you my standard question: when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
I have kind of that storybook start. I was 13 years old. My next door neighbor was an FBI agent. I grew up in the Midwest, and I distinctly remember him telling my dad a story about chasing a bank robber down an alley and tackling him. And I remember thinking, that is what I'm going to do. It's not often you get to live your childhood dream, but for 23 years, I was able to chase bank robbers down an alley and do what I wanted to do from when I was a kid. I really feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. It was a great career, and I'm just happy it happened.
You're recently retired, about 5 months out of the FBI. What are you doing now?
Yeah, there is life after the FBI. I wasn't sure there was after so many years in there, but there is. I'm working for Amazon now. I work for Amazon Global Security, and I'm helping create a crisis management program. The last time I worked in the private sector, I was a bartender. So we'll see how this one goes. It's a little different.
Well, I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
It's difficult for me to talk about this case because it hasn't been a success in my mind, because we haven't caught Jason. It's not totally solved until you can bring justice to the victim's family. And so this is a tough one for me. This is one that I would think was a failure in my career. I just ask that if you do know where Jason is, if you've got any knowledge that might help the FBI find him, do it for the victim's family. Keith Palomares and his family, they deserve justice. They deserve this case to be resolved.
And that's the end of the interview. If you have any information about the whereabouts of Jason Derek Brown, please contact your local FBI office or the nearest U.S. Embassy or consulate. Remember, he's considered armed and extremely dangerous. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Lance Leising and Jamie Martin Brown. There are newspaper articles and videos regarding the FBI's 10 Most Wanted program and the investigation of Jason Derek Brown. You'll find his official FBI Most Wanted Fugitive poster, a photo of Jamie and Jason together, and a link to Jamie's book, Center of Attention, the life story of Jamie Brown Martin, the sister of one of the world's most wanted fugitives, and her journey to accept that despite being a product of the same crazy environment as her brother, her life and her path are her own. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to audio. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.